Welcome to day 2 of the PovertyCure Summit. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. I'm the director of PovertyCure here at the Acton Institute. Our first panel is India's Journey to Prosperity and Growth, featuring Gurcharan and Sanjeev Sanyal, as well as several others. Now, this panel will be conducted in English, and I want to remind you that during the panel, there'll be a chat going on, so please feel free to participate that as the discussion ensues.
This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Indian Constitution. India is an interesting, diverse country in the modern world, with its people differentiated by territory, religion, caste, cuisine, and technology. The most populous country with over 1.4 billion people and contains 1/6 of humankind. Its economic transformation since 1991 policy reforms, its adaptation in digital technologies, and enterprising private sector has lifted millions out of poverty and unleashed a mass flourishing of entrepreneurship and wealth creation in India. Lot needs to be done after successive governments had denied prosperity to Indians with decades of central planning, state socialism, and crony capitalism. In India's history, currently there is a substantial decline in the number of people in poverty. India has the potential to set the world on a new course of technological innovation and sustain prosperity. Additionally, with a new world of global difficulties, Indian foreign policy should actively engage in and promote initiatives aimed at fostering global peace, stability, and globalization. As an ambitious middle-income emerging economy, India is challenged to develop the right institutional frameworks to become a $10 trillion economy by 2030. Acton Institute's affiliate advisor, Manoj Mathew, discussed with India's leading policy thinkers and practitioners to find out what is India doing right and what reforms it needs to do to accelerate growth and prosperity. Let's listen to Gurcharan Das, author and thought leader, Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of India, Amir Ullah Khan, health and education economist, Jyoti, Director General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, a non-governmental trade association, Anoop Awasthi, advocate on record of the Honorable Supreme Court of India, Ajay Shah, co-founder, XKDR Forum.
India began its journey as a modern nation in 1947. It quickly became an enviable, robust democracy. But it was saddled for the first 40 years of its life as an over-regulated, command socialist economy that we called the license Raj. In 1991, these controls of the license Raj were dismantled and India gave its people economic freedom. It has done well. It has grown at 6% per year on the average. It has lifted 450 million people out of poverty, and the middle class has grown from 10% to 30%. However, it has not created the jobs that should have come with this 6% growth, largely because it has not created yet an industrial revolution. And thus the question is, how will 45% of the people working on the farms, how will they get better, productive, higher income, middle class jobs? That is the challenge that India faces today. It may have become the fastest growing economy in the world, but it still needs to do the essential and reforms and attitude changes. Fortunately, the conditions for creating this industrial revolution today are better than ever. The infrastructure is vastly improved. Road mileage, in fact, has doubled from 2011 to 2021. Port handling capacity has quadrupled. There's been a digital revolution to the point where the digital, the whole digital infrastructure has spread across the country and removed a lot of the friction that existed before. It's also an age of startups in India, where we have over 100 unicorns. However, we still need to do significant reforms of land, of labor, and in agriculture. And this is tough work. It's tough also because none of the leaders of India since 1991 has actually sold the reforms. They have not sold the market. And therefore people still believe that the reforms or the market makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. They cannot distinguish between being pro-market and pro-business. Thus, we need leaders like Margaret Thatcher or Reagan or even Deng Xiaoping, who didn't have to sell the market to anyone. He was a dictator, but he sold the market. And hence, really, the bigger reforms that are needed are in governance. The governance, we have the classic problem of judicial delay, and judicial delay means justice denied. We have to reform the bureaucracy, which is still going in its old way, unlike, say, the Chinese bureaucracy, which was reformed to actually facilitate. The incentive system of the Chinese bureaucracy improved because power was delegated down below, and there was an incentive for creating market-based activity. So there's a tough road ahead, but this is the time, better than ever, to do it. Indians have always been an entrepreneurial people. And so, once these reforms are done, I'm confident that the entrepreneurs will deliver the jobs. Moreover, the government needs to still open the economy to lower the tariffs so that India joins up with the global value chains. And that's the other unfinished business that needs to be addressed. But overall, I'm confident that we can create an industrial revolution, particularly now when I can see some of the entrepreneurs focused on electronics, manufacturing, and some of the labor-intensive areas which will solve the jobs problem. India has always been an entrepreneurial culture, and once these reforms set in, there is no doubt in my mind that India, within the next generation, by 2047, when it will be 100 years old, it will become a country where the average person, from an economic point of view, will be at ease, where middle class will be more than 50%. And my hope is that the entrepreneurs who are today at the cutting edge of the knowledge economy and the digital economy will also focus on the labor-intensive sectors. And to this end, India needs to lower its tariffs, it needs to join up with the global value chains, It needs to attract particularly now where there is some disillusionment with China, it needs to attract the big global brands to come and manufacture here the way, for example, the iPhone 16 has done. And so I think we can look forward to a happy story ahead.
Hello friends, it's a pleasure to speak to the Acton Institute. As you're all aware, the Indian economy is currently, by some margin, the fastest growing economy in the world, growing at about 7% this year. Last year we grew at about 8%. And as a result of this, many of the things that we had promised the Indian population decades ago when we became independent are finally 7.5 decades later beginning to come true. We are removing people out of poverty. Indians are doing well in all kinds of fields, from business to science. And so it has been quite a journey. And yet, as you may be aware, we wasted half a century as a socialist country, putting on ourselves all kinds of red tape that didn't allow these kinds of changes to happen for 45 odd years, till we began to finally reform our economy in 1990. So all of what you are seeing now was made possible by a huge reform and liberalization program that has been going on for the last 30 years and finally now beginning to bear fruit. Now, as a part of this effort to push India's economy forward, we have been doing a large number of reforms. And these reforms, as I told you, are bearing fruit to an extent that this year we will become the world's 4th largest economy, and then by about 2027 we will become the world's 3rd largest economy. Among the many reforms that we have done in the last decade or so, there have been some very big ones which you will read about quite easily in newspapers and so on. We introduced a GST system, which was like a free trade agreement. India did it with itself by essentially getting rid of all kinds of small state taxes and unifying it into one GST-based system for the whole country. We created an insolvency and bankruptcy system which allowed us to do the creative destruction process, so that we cleaned up our banks using this IBC process. Now all of these are very big reforms, and many people who follow India will be aware of them. But the real game changer in some sense has been not the very big reforms, but the very small ones. We call them process reforms here in India. These are the nuts and bolts reforms that you need to do in order to clean up government processes. So these process reforms have been done across the whole gamut of government interaction with business, with society and so on. The aim is to promote the ease of living, the ease of doing business. Why am I emphasizing on this? Because you see, for far too long, attention tends to go to these very large structural reforms. And yet, much of the friction in the system actually happens because of these small nuts and bolts inefficiencies. So I'm very pleased to see in the US, for example, you have Elon Musk talking about a government efficiency commission. Well, we have been doing this for the last decade or so right here in India. I've myself been a part of that effort, and let me say, it works. So go out there and look at government processes of all kinds. It's not very difficult for what you do with business processes. Some of you may be business leaders, and you've probably done that in your institutions already. It requires you to take an issue which very often it's quite easy to identify an inefficiency, do a mapping of the as-is process, figure out where the blockage is. Very, very likely 90% of the problem is actually in 10% of the process. Fix it, and of course then do a series of feedback loops to make sure that whatever change you made is actually working. This works in any kind of process. It also works in government process. Obviously, the implementation of it is slightly different because it requires us to change rules, it requires engaging in public outreach and so on, which is a part of public life. But the general logic of it is not so different. And let me give you examples of things we have managed to fix. For example, India, as you know, is a source of a lot of new innovations, particularly in software and services and so on. And yet you'll be shocked to know that just 6-7 years ago, India used to not even do 10,000 patents a year. Just to put it in context, the US does 350,000 patents a year. China does 700,000 patents a year. I mean, we can debate about the quality of the Chinese patents, but the fact of the matter is those are the numbers they are generating. And yet, India was not even doing 10,000 patents a year. We looked at the process, we cleaned it up, but the net result is, in the financial year just ended, we did 100,000 patents a year. Now that's a 10 times increase in the number of patents in 6 years. And we are still improving the system. I'm just giving this as an example, but we have done this with many other things. For example, everybody knows about India's business process outsourcing, back office, call centers, all this kind of business growing in India. But you'll be shocked to know that India's telecom ministry used to have onerous requirements for compliance on these companies, which are maybe famous in the rest of the world, but in India they had all kinds of restrictions on them. 2-3 years ago, we again simplified the system, and now 92% of these back office outsourcing and software companies say that their compliance burden has declined. 28% actually said the compliance burden declined 50%. So these are not trivial changes that we are making, and we are doing it at every level. Similarly, we are going there and shutting down government institutions, autonomous bodies and so on, which have outlived their utility. So the central government of India alone has 850 autonomous bodies. Now some of them are obviously useful. You have the central bank, you have the markets regulator, all of these are good institutions, I have no quarrel with them. But there are large numbers of them that may have been useful in an earlier era and have outlived their utility, but they still hang around in the system, cluttering up the pathways of the economy and of course sucking resources. We have begun to shut quite a few of them down, and again, despite dire warnings from both government officials, from NGOs, from economists, once we shut them down, we discovered that nothing bad happened. Every indicator, the system worked more efficiently. So again, just another example of things that maybe the US Government Efficiency Commission that is hopefully be set up soon will be able to do in terms of going out there, digging into government systems, giving into government departments, and no, there is no problem with shutting these down. We have discovered, if it doesn't make, if an institution cannot make a case for its existence, it should not exist. The gains you get from making these small changes in aggregate turn out to be very, very large. The gains you get from making these small changes in aggregate turn out to be very, very large. Of course, the examples I gave came from national government, but this is true at every level. This is true of municipal governments, it's true of state governments, this is of course national governments, but also, by the way, international agencies. The UN, IMF, World Bank, WTO, you name every kind of these international agencies, there's large amount of inefficiencies on of them. Many of these bodies can be shut down. There has to be a proper audit of the usefulness of various UN bodies, and I would argue that those that are not pulling their weight need to be radically restructured or even closed down. So the point I'm making here throughout is process reform matter. They matter at every level of institution, including, by the way, non-government institutions as well. An institution is drawing on resources. It has to make a case for its existence. So with that, let me say that efficiency gains matter and process reforms matter. So no matter where you are in the world, a greater attention paid to this issue. Thank you very much.
It's now fairly established that India's growth story is remarkable. The question remains about India's development story, and that is where the big debate goes on, particularly in the areas of health and education. With a 132 rank on the UNDP's development index or the HR index, it is anybody's guess as to why India hasn't been able to reach the potential that it sought to achieve 30 years ago. The focus really remains on health and then on education. Now let's see each one of these and try and understand where the problems lie and what the state has been doing towards this. The one thing that we must clarify right away is that both in health and education in India, interestingly, the private sector plays a larger role than the state does. For a country that promised to deliver public goods, this is something that was not expected. Today, nearly 80% of healthcare is privatized, and more than 50% of even primary education is in the private sector. Let's first handle the health sector. The health indices are nothing to boast about. Life expectancy hovers around 70. Maternal mortality in the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar is still among the lowest in the world. Infant mortality has been done slightly better, but child nutrition is at a very, very poor state. Now, what this means is that there is a great pressure on the health sector to perform if India needs to continue to grow at above 10% per year. Say the story very clearly. It is the health sector and the lack of health care that is the single largest cause for chronic poverty in India. The government data which comes through the National Family Health Survey tells us that about 55 million people drop into chronic poverty because of one episode of illness. And therefore, the salient features of the health sector today are that primary health is in terrible shape, and tertiary health, paradoxically, is among the best in the world. You have people coming into India to get the highest quality health care at the lowest prices from across the globe. Sadly, public health and primary health is in shambles. And it was evident very clearly during the COVID crisis, where millions of people just waited to get a bed, and several fatalities were recorded just because of the absence of basic facilities like ventilators or intensive care units. So what has the state been doing? First, and here was a controversial move, it has centralized healthcare to a large extent through a scheme called the Ayushman Bharat scheme. Centralizing healthcare in a country like India is a contentious subject. There are states in India like Kerala where the health indicators are far better than even most Scandinavian countries. But there are states like Assam and Bihar where the indicators are worse off than sub-Saharan Africa. So to normalize, to ensure that there is steady quality, there is a lot more that needs to be done, particularly by way of ensuring that there is a larger amount of money available for the healthcare, and that the private sector is allowed to practice and allowed to give healthcare to those in the primary sector. Of course, there has to be a great emphasis on public health, which in some sense has been addressed by ensuring that some money is being spent on health, hygiene and sanitation. Let's move to education. India probably is among the few countries where the education spending is more than its spending on healthcare. And therefore, what we have is a slightly better state of education, though the same problem exists. Primary education is in bad shape, and that is validated by several surveys that suggest that most students who are in 8th standard and 9th standard are unable to read class 3 textbooks, even in their own languages. The tertiary sector does well. You have examples of institutions like the cliched Indian Institutes of Management and Indian Institutes of Technology, which provide a large amount of human resource to the entire world. But behind both health and education, while there is the issue of spending and that is going up because of good tax collections, the crucial missing link remains the staffing. We do not have enough doctors. The doctor to patient ratio is still above 1 to 10,000. We do not have enough teachers. We still have 1 million teachers missing in the education system. And therefore, it is this very important brick in the wall that causes most of the problem in healthcare and education. And this is so very evident because those states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala that have done well by way of human resources, done well by way of providing enough infrastructure in the public space, have some of the best indicators available. Take the gross enrollment ratios. Tamil Nadu is a state where nearly half the population goes to college, whereas you have Bihar or Assam where not even a tenth can go beyond high school. For a country that seeks to provide millions of jobs in the service sector, the lack of education is the single biggest problem that denies people the opportunity to work in a sector where they get reasonable wages. Therefore, what India's move ought to be is to decentralize health and education as much as possible, allow states to take various steps or varying steps to become better than the other, allow a strong and a vibrant, well-regulated private sector that has delivered in the past and can deliver in most aspects of health and education, and certainly increase its spending on R&D and on training doctors and training teachers. Both health and education have benefited tremendously from action which has emerged from civil society and private initiative. And that is really the foundation of good health and good education in the country. There are many examples of projects that have taken off, led by innovation, which have delivered great health care, cardiac diseases, that have improved public health delivery, that have even gone into issues of menstrual health and mental health. Similarly, in education, you see that a large number of students today go to budget schools that provide reasonable quality of education at a price that the poor can afford. The problem is that while the education and the health system provides very high quality health to the elite, the poor miss out, and the reason for that is the rising costs of both health and education. And that today becomes the single biggest issue as far as improving health and education indicators are concerned. Both health and education costs are the single biggest drivers of inflation in India, and therefore what happens when food prices go up is that there is an almost immediate cut in costs of education and students dropping out of school. So the initiatives that need to be taken are clearly a very big thrust on training teachers. The new education policy that was launched hesitantly about 8 years ago did mention this and put a strong emphasis on the continuous training of teachers. On the health aspect, it is a strange point that we have more nurses than doctors in most states, and acute scarcity of nurses causes a great deal of instability in the health system. The government has announced that there are going to be more than 165,000 nurses being produced every year in the near future, and that should take some of this pressure away from expensive doctors. The rural-urban divide is significant. The interstate divide is very large, and this is what needs to be addressed by ensuring that good quality teaching, good quality infrastructure is available across the country, both in urban and rural India. It is health and education today that defines labor productivity. The largest reason for absenteeism in our factories is ill health. One of the strongest reasons for students not learning enough in class is poor nutrition. It's important for us to focus equally on health and education, because any discrepancy or any one going down is going to impact the other, and together this is going to ensure that India is not going to reach the $5 trillion economy it wants to in the next couple of years, or the 10 trillion in the next 5 years.
I'm delighted to be with all of you to talk about the potential of the Indian economy, and I think we at FICCI get to hear about the potential of the country from not only just the investors within the country, but also a lot of international investors as well, which really created a very solid foundation for the next leap for the economy. We have all the blocks in place really at the moment, which is that we've got the right kind of policy reforms. We have the recognition of how the businesses really need to operate by kind of easing the business environment, by decriminalizing a lot of legislations, plus also fiscal balance and providing the injection of the capital where it is most required, which is the capital expenditure, which actually stabilize the growth rates as well. So given all of that, I think it's giving a lot of confidence to the industry that the economy is really moving in the right direction that they would like to see that to be. Also, the goal of the Viksit Bharat, which has been envisaged by the government and the Prime Minister's vision, which has been laid out, the goal to be a developed country by 2047. I think a lot of reform measures that are being taken are moving in that direction. There are issues like labor reforms, etc., where I think the speed needs to be accelerated at the state government level. And I must say that the ease of doing business ratings that have been created gives the direction to the states, in these areas, and they can provide the kind of business environment which is required for businesses to get attracted to those areas. So I think this collaborative, competitive kind of a spirit which has been created will really hold us in good stead. We at FICCI, given the Viksit Bharat goal, we've also defined 4 or 5 priority areas which will help in achieving these visions. So these are the areas which we feel are very critical, where industry along with the government really needs to work collaboratively. While the industry can have a lot of initiatives defined for themselves, but there are policy enablers that will be required on the way to achieve this. So we're working on Make in India so that the manufacturing growth which has been envisaged, because manufacturing is very critical for us to be able to absorb the numbers that are getting added every year in the labor force. So therefore, for that to really be at a cutting edge and for India to become one of the large exporters in manufacturing space, what we required is most definitely a goal of having 80% of our manufacturing being self-reliant in those areas. So we're also looking at a skilled manpower, particularly in the Industry 4.0 space, and both sustainability, quality and safety are going to be very critical. So how do we create capacities to be able to create that manufacturing base, which can then also be part of the global supply chain going forward. The second priority area that we have defined for ourselves is the agriculture space, and the overall goal is to be able to double the exports by 2030. And to do that, what is required is essentially be able to give a huge push to farm mechanization, have water efficiency, create sustainable practices, also have the climate resilient seeds, create a workforce which is able to also on the ground help in managing the farm implements, and thus achieve not only the self-reliance in agriculture but also exports. The third most important area which we picked up, which is the women-led development. I think what is most important in the women-led development is to have them in the workforce, and we being a association of industry are really looking at how we can have our members have higher workforce of women, and that would definitely require the right kind of skilling. So identifying the right skill areas, work with the government ecosystem to help create the courses in which women can really get trained in, and not necessarily just the traditional areas but even the harder areas in manufacturing as well. We're also working in the sustainability space, which is very, very critical as well. So in sustainability, we're looking at the EV, giving a push to the EV ecosystem, and the second part of course is in terms of having the companies achieve their net zero target. So these are what the priorities set out by us to work along with the government. So these can definitely help add to the strength of the economy and achieve the mission and the vision that has been laid out by the Honorable Prime Minister, in which everybody needs to partake for that to become a success.
Rule of law is a mechanism where the makers of the law as well as for those that law is made, all are accountable to same set of laws. If there is rule of law, then there would be prosperity. If there is no rule of law, there will be chaos. In India, we are facing a problem of so many laws and their poor implementation. We have the machinery of maintaining law and order, that is our police, but they have a colonial mindset and they are not considered friendly. We are having a judiciary which is completely overburdened with millions and millions of cases pending there. So access of justice is also a big challenge. In India, access to justice is actually very expensive. Even the middle class persons are not able to do that. Think about those who are daily wagers, taxi drivers, private security personals, small shopkeepers. The opportunity cost of upholding their rights by approaching a system, either police or court of law, is very expensive. They are going to lose that particular day's wages, so they can't afford to fight for their rights for a very long period. In order to help them out, there is a mechanism of class action that has been evolved during the course of the process, the public interest litigations. The fellow persons who are more socially conscious, they come forward, or the non-government organizations, they also come forward, and our constitutional courts have done wonderful in terms of maintaining the rule of law through these class action litigations, public interest litigations. But still a lot has to be achieved. The system is required to be made poor friendly. The access to justice is required to be made less expensive. The pendency is required to be reduced a lot. Unless we achieve that, I feel that there would be great difficulty in upholding and maintaining the rule of law in a country which has multicultural, diverse kind of people living here. So the fabric that binds us all together is the rule of law, and it is to be maintained. There is another dynamics of rule of law. In a country like India, where we are so many states which have lagged behind in the course of development, the nature of prevailing litigation therein shows that particular perspective. In the states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, and other states which are not so prosperous, the criminal litigation is mostly on the rise. The judiciary is full with them. People are fighting with each other. They are approaching courts on that. But in states where they have touched the taste of economic development, it is the civil litigation that takes the lead. So that is also a factor that shows that if we are little prosperous, if we are good, if economic development has percolated to the lowest strata of society, the general nature of litigation is nature of civil litigation. Another important thing is the paying capacity also becomes high. So the incentive to have access to justice becomes more. Person with having some money in their pocket can definitely go and assert their right in the court of law, as well as they have the confidence to approach the police. If you are a poor person, you are fearful about the machinery. You can't talk to the police personnel whose image is not people friendly. So it is difficult. So access to justice becomes easy if you are not poor. But if you are poor, then access to justice becomes a nightmare in a country like India. So with poverty, the rule of law is just a misnomer. With prosperity only, the rule of law can be actually and really implemented in India.
There are few bigger problems in the world when compared with the problems of mass poverty in India. But when we look back at the last 30 years, we got huge gains in economic growth. We got huge gains in the poverty rate. This was not done by traditional conceptions of development assistance or development economics or humanitarian aid. It was done by the emergence of a capable market economy. And I feel that's a very important lesson for all of us, that we got great human gains in the well-being of the people because the economy started working better, not because of traditional conceptions of development economics or state-led development or humanitarian assistance. And this is really the story that we should be looking towards for the next 30 years. That how can you make progress in India? The essence lies in energizing the economic growth. How can we get back to a strong growth process? When we look back, we see that from 1991 to 2011, there was a beautiful period of about 20 years of high economic growth. Our highest imperative today is to understand the sources of that growth, to understand why growth broke down, and to put the pieces into place through which sustained high economic growth can resume. Ideally, it should be growth that goes on for years and years and decades, like we see in the history of the UK or the United States. Or else, can we get another 20 years of a high growth episode? This is the most important question. How to make growth happen? Why does growth happen? Why do growth episodes end? This is what we have to figure out. In my opinion, the reason why that growth episode ended and why we in India have a significant set of challenges today lies in a two-part problem. In India, we suffer from too much central planning and not enough rule of law. We have too much central planning. The government is telling people what to do. The government controls the people. The government chooses technologies. The government interferes in business models and processes and technical choices all around the economy. And that's just suboptimal. No government knows how to make those kind of choices. And the second problem is rule of law. Too much about the working of the Indian state is a capricious, personalized form of arbitrary power without adequate checks and balances, which can often turn into the power to expropriate. And when private persons are given the threat of expropriation, they respond by pulling back on their financial and emotional commitment to building businesses in the country. This includes both domestics and foreign investors. So that's my strategic sense of what lies ahead for India, that we have to get out of the modes of humanitarian thinking or development economics as it is conventionally done, of top-down state-led development. And we have to refashion the Indian state in a way that does less central planning and more rule of law. And that will create conditions for the private energy, the private optimism, where domestic and foreign persons will build a great economic future for the country, which will do more for the well-being of the people than any amount of state-led development could have.
Economic progress creates wealth, a way to increase knowledge and human betterment through investment and philanthropy. What India is doing is a manifestation of voluntary interactions, a measure of human solidarity, a source of guarding the right of economic initiative and human flourishing. We also know no nation has ever become rich without an educated and healthy population. India needs to provide dignified life to its people with economic progress. Let's hope for greater economic freedom in India. Keeping economic freedom intact is an ongoing project in India, where civil society and markets have vital roles in building a free and prosperous country.